Good. Thank you very much, and welcome to today's seminar for Researchers Desk. Today we have Oskar Berglund with us here. Oskar is a senior lecturer in international public and social policy out of University of Bristol in the UK. And Oskar has worked with studying social movements and their use of civil disobedience to achieve their aims, and has looked particularly at the Extinction Rebellion, for instance, and how they then justified their lawbreaking in this. And we'll address sort of the topic of, will sitting in a road actually save the world here? So with this, I give the floor to you, Oskar. Welcome.
Thank you. So are we doing this in English then, just to check?
We are, yeah.
Yeah, we are. Good. In that case, I'll start the presentation. So thank you for that introduction, Glenn. I don't think that I will say much more about myself. I mean, I started studying climate change activism in 2019 when it went a bit bigger. So since then, that's what I've sort of dedicated my research and teaching to. So that started obviously with Extinction Rebellion, and now I'm involved with a project studying, well, really public opinion and sort of public attitudes towards more recent climate and around more recent climate protests in mainly the UK, but also Germany. We've got an opinion poll going out in Germany later this week, I believe. So linked to last generation protests there. So yeah, I'll bring in, if you've seen me present somewhere before, then it's more than possible that some of this you will have heard before, but otherwise, but I will also, draw on our more recent findings. So I chose this slightly, spicy title, Will Sitting in the Road Save the World? Probably not on its own, you've got to say. But I suppose, what we're interested in is really, what is the role of doing this kind of protest in as part of the bigger societal picture. So first then, why do movements, why do activists choose to disobey? And then, the most obvious reason, and maybe one that is really seen as, I think, almost excessively focused on by activists, is media attention. So when you speak to activists, it's basically like, if we don't achieve the media attention, then it hasn't really been worth it. That is the key goal. And that was interesting, for example, in relation to when Just Stop Oil started here in the UK. They started off as a movement that wanted to abandon the more kind of public disruption aspects of Extinction Rebellion and focus more on just stopping oil at the root, so at the oil distribution centers and so on. But realized that didn't garner very much. So it was a high-risk activity that didn't really get much media attention. So then they went sort of back to more public disruption, which has proven to create much more media attention. Now, then you got to ask what that media attention is for. And so, what is it that gets attention when you do that? So we've done some media analysis around that in the UK, and for example, found that, it doesn't really, so it doesn't give more attention to your group. Obviously, it is a good way of getting media attention. You don't need very many people in order to get quite a lot of attention. I mean, you're talking about hundreds, maybe thousands of people that are heavily involved in this kind of climate activism in the UK, and probably a lot fewer than that in Sweden, that still generates a fair amount of media attention. But then what is it that gets attention? So we don't see, for example, an increase in reporting on climate change in general as a result of these protests. It is what gets attention is the group, and then often, obviously, that media attention isn't necessarily positive. Now, you can also get media attention to your purpose, and there, obviously, the move in this kind of more recent, in the last 2 years, wave of climate protests that Återställ våtmarkerna is part of as well. When some of the names in the network and the A22 network of climate groups in different European countries have names that relate to a specific aim, right? That's quite clever, I think. Last Generation doesn't, but Just Stop Oil do, and Dernière Rénovation in France do, and Återställ våtmarkerna do, because then you can get attention to the issue by simply being mentioned, right? So you can see how the issue of våtmarker in Sweden has become a bigger issue and something that people is more aware of because of the protests. But otherwise, it's easier to get media attention than to get that media attention to focus on the things that you want to focus on. Then if you look at the sort of reasoning behind of activists, then the thinking comes from sort of one strand of civil resistance scholarship, really, that has been quite influential on why and how these protests take place. They talk a lot about creating a tension in society that uses the kind of polarization that has been increasing in society anyway over recent decades, and using civil disobedience to kind of further polarize the public, to push that you're pushing some people away from engaging with climate change, but you are getting other people. The hope is that you get people that are concerned about climate change to kind of come closer to joining the movement, I suppose. And there, it must be said that it hasn't been very successful in the last couple of years. The climate change activism is limited to a very small proportion of the population, but it can also sort of politicize issues, right? And there we have seen some more success. So you can say that the issue of våtmarker in Sweden or new oil and gas licenses in the UK have been politicized. So they become issues that politicians have to take a stand on, and that become obviously politically costly for politicians not to take a stand on, or to take a stand that will alienate people. It doesn't always go in the direction that you'd want it to go. I mean, the British government have chosen to publicly endorse new oil and gas licenses, and have thereby also kind of secured support within from amongst conservative voters for new oil and gas licenses. So the polarization in that sense, and the politicization, has kind of gone in a way that is not maybe according to what Just Stop Oil wanted in the first place. Something that I think often gets lost is that that when you choose where you do your action, is that civil disobedience is fundamentally about legitimacy. It's about it's about questioning and challenging, contesting the legitimacy of the actors that you are against and the issues that you're up against. And when you do disruption against the general public, then that kind of gets diluted a bit, because that legitimacy angle doesn't, it tends to actually decrease the legitimacy of the protesters a lot, and not necessarily have a very, very clear aim. And one sort of negative effect of this polarization, of course, is that climate action has become a kind of part of the culture war. It has been so in the US, of course, for a long time, with climate change denialism being very widespread on the political right. It hasn't been like that. It's not like that in the UK. It's not like that in Spain. It's not like that really in France. It is like that a bit more in Sweden. So you see a higher percentage of right-wing voters, particularly I imagine in Sverigedemokraterna, who are who are, deny, or this climate change denialism is more common in Sweden than it is in a lot of other European countries. So, and that climate action becoming part of the culture war, I think that we can see that this kind of activism feeds that, and that's something that I would say is a unfortunate side effect of that. And I'll get back to maybe thinking about why that is. But one very good reason to disobey and to engage in direct action is that you can achieve direct results. So this is not the case maybe when you want to återställa våtmarker, but it can be the case when you want a university to divest from fossil fuels or so on. So if you have a demand that is smaller and that is directed at an actor that has the power to enact that demand, then it is effective. Like it is engaging in disruption is much more effective than any other kind of protest when if the demand is kind of directly achievable. So then that gets into the question of what makes it work. And then, the demand is important, achievable demands, smaller demands, demands that the actor that you're protesting can enact, demands that, and if you think about these sort of bigger ones, then like återställ våtmarker or just stop oil, then demands that can make sense to the general public. So that it's immediately obvious, because you don't necessarily get to speak to people. It is in the name that gets spread that you get to communicate this demand. Targets are important, right? So it matters who you're targeting. So if you're targeting the general public, the best that can happen is that you will get media attention, and that media attention will give you room to speak about the issue so that it will give you a platform to talk about it. Now that doesn't always happen, and that's we know that these groups are largely very disliked by the public, and that's it's difficult for activists to achieve that platform. And in terms of public opinion about these issues, it hasn't really it's very difficult to get those to kind of shifts on the basis of these protests. So you don't gain much popularity from it, and you can get an issue talked about, but it's hard to actually substantially move sort of public opinion about it. Now, if you have a more logical target with your protests, and I suppose that's something that I have always throughout my research really, pointed out as something that is important, then you don't rely so much. The media attention isn't as central to, or what happens, the way you get reported about isn't as central. It doesn't just come down to that, because you can delegitimize your. So if you sit on the road, you're the one who gets delegitimized in a way. Whereas if you have a target with your protest, and I mean, those targets can be very different ones, right? It can be a institution that you want to divest from fossil fuels. It can be, fossil fuel companies themselves. It can be, politicians or whatever. But if protests are targeted, then you have kind of that legitimacy aspect coming into it in a different way. And I think it's something that I have focused a lot on, and that I certainly wrote a lot about when I wrote early on about Extinction Rebellion, is that what that target is says something about your politics. So if those targets are kind of corporate targets, or if they are targets that are aimed at kind of severing the ties between public institutions and corporate, or particularly fossil fuel actors, then that says something about your politics, and that has more of a purpose in a way than something that that is just aimed at kind of policymakers. What looms large over a lot of these kinds of protests, and particularly this, the network of activists that are active right now, is the thinking of Roger Hallam, who was one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, who spent 1 year doing reading for a PhD at King's in London about protest and so on, and then basically thought that he had found the way to save the world. And a lot of what he said, he focused on arrests, on like this, the importance of getting arrested. It's based a lot on sort of the experiences of the US civil rights movement, and he was, he believed very strongly in this kind of idea of polarization, and that if you would be seen to get arrested, then people would get outraged, and you would get more people joining you, and then it would be then the resistance would be so strong that it would be that the state would basically lose support and lose strength by clamping down on you. Now, I think we can see with what's going on in the world that hasn't happened. There's a lot of people locked up in many different countries, and there's been a big authoritarian backlash that has been highlighted by people like the UN Secretary General and so on. And I'm actually trying to get funding now to study more about that authoritarian backlash, so all these anti-protest legislations that is coming up in a lot of different countries around the world, across the global north and the global south. But people aren't particularly outraged by it, right? And part of that is because the protesters aren't very popular. So as opposed to, he has this view of, you've got to get more extreme, but that getting more extreme hasn't grown the movement. The movement is a lot smaller now than it was in 2019 when this kind of, thinking, or 2018, 2019 when this kind of thinking started. So it hasn't been very successful in building a movement. And part of that is because A, these groups aren't very popular, and B, because the threshold to, if people think, there was interesting research coming out of Germany, some of you might have seen it a couple of months ago, saying that climate activism has become a lot less popular and lost support. Now, those questions were asked about climate activism. That drop is huge, and I can only explain that by that when the first of these surveys was done a few years ago, when people heard the term climate activists, they were thinking about Greta Thunberg and about the climate strikes that were very big in Germany and so on, that garnered a lot of support. And now when people hear about climate protests and get asked about climate activists, they think about Last Generation and people sitting in the road, and those are not popular. So that kind of, so that speaks to this kind of unpopularity, which makes it difficult to recruit, because if being a climate activist means that 85% of the population hate you, then it doesn't become a particularly appealing thing to do. It also has a very high threshold for, okay, if being a climate activist means that you are prepared to be arrested, then that's a very high threshold for people to join in with, quite different from going on a climate march. So I think we can see that in isolation, this kind of protest can achieve certain things, right? But it's hard to it's sad in a way that this is now that this is the climate movement right now, because that's not enough, and that's not necessarily what's going to drive change, even though you can achieve things through this kind of disruptive protest. That on its own is not enough. I think that view is something that is becoming clearer with the project that I'm kind of involved in right now. And then something that what I see as my role maybe in all this as a kind of politics scholar and political economist, critical political economist. So I always study protest as part of a broader system, which is capitalism in whatever form it takes. So always ask, people, anybody who thinks about these issues, really, and particularly activists, what is it that stands in the way of action on climate change? What is it systemically that is stopping us to act on climate change? And then, answers become about capitalism, and okay, what is it about capitalism? So, I'm in one of my lectures, I get students unpack capitalism. So what is capitalism anyway? So what is it? Is it growth? A lot of, obviously, the degrowth literature focuses on growth. So what role is that, and what roles do property rights play in this? Who has the right to own what and do what with it? Or is it profit and the kind of things that you're allowed to profit from as a private actor? Or a lot of these things are not either or, but kind of where currently does the line go between what you're allowed to own and what you're allowed to profit from, and how might that need to be different if we're going to have an ecologically sustainable society? So if you think, in a way, I ask people to think about that before they decide, what is it that we're going to be protesting against, right? So then it matters, okay, so what is the role of the state, and what is the role of private actors and sectors, and what is the role of the fossil fuel industry, and what's the role of the financial industry in relation to that? What's the role of the higher education industry, which, if you live in the UK, you very much feel that this is an industry as opposed to a public service that I work in, or public sector. Then, and then things like severing the ties between the fossil fuel industry and these other parts of society become important, and then a way of saying, okay, so that's where we can direct these kind of protests. Or is the reasoning that we live in a consumerist, individualized society, so actually disrupting the general public and getting them to ask questions about their behavior in this becomes relevant. And when you ask people about what do you do about climate change, or what could you imagine doing, it all comes down to kind of individual consumerist kind of behavior. And often what people point out is that it's kind of low level activities that or quite low carbon intensive activities that people think about first when they think about what they can do about things. So if the aim is to politicize people, then what is the best way to do that? And I think there, sitting in the road has probably not shown to be that great of a tactic in the sense of politicizing the public. So when you think about how to intervene in this as a kind of activist, then I think a lot of the focus from a lot of the people researching this, and I think we have some people from like Extinction Rebellion here as well, has been about, and a lot of interest has been about public opinion. And I think a lot of, I'm also now then involved in a project that measures public opinion. But I think that becomes a bit dangerous in that we are doing that, I think, partly because it's measurable. So people want to know, like, okay, does this work, and so on, and then okay, so what? And then we measure public opinion. And the fact is that it has a very often a very limited effect on public opinion, and that just because we can measure public opinion, it's sort of, that doesn't make it important, but that the ideas about, or so the purpose of building a movement is perhaps much more important and much harder to measure, apart from saying that, well, we're not building a movement, we are not, the movement isn't growing, right now, not in Europe, certainly. Yes, so I think I've just, I have, yeah, I think I'll just draw an end there, and then we can open questions. So I end up talking quite a lot about, I suppose, my current research project has made me slightly less enthusiastic about where the movement is right now, and what sitting in the road in particular can achieve. And one last thing that I wanted to say is that one really damaging thing I think that comes through is when there are confrontations between activists and drivers. Basically, I think that's something that it's good. Getting pictures sent out about activists being dragged away by police, I think, is a good thing. It shows that the police is on the side of extracting forces of the fossil fuel industry in a way, if that's the enemy. But making members of the general public the enemy, and obviously getting pictures around the world of confrontations between activists and members of the public, it makes the general public the enemy, and that I think is damaging for the movement as such. So yes, I'll end there and open up for questions.
Thank you very much, Oscar, for a really interesting talk.